Hello, everyone. Hi, everyone, again. Thank you for coming to this session, which is part of Neurathon. Today, we have Chinmayi, who is the CEO of Simply Neuroscience with us. She's a medical humanities and neuroepidemiology student at Columbia, and today she's going to be sharing what it means to be a neuroscience leader, as well as talking about different leadership roles across academic, entrepreneurship, and outreach spaces in neuroscience. Please keep your cameras and microphones off at all times if you're not okay with being recorded and put onto YouTube. And if you have any Q&As at all during the session, you guys can put it in the chat and we will be answering that at the end of the session. Thank you. And we'll get on to Chinmayi's presentation.
Awesome. Thank you, Megan. And good morning, everyone, or good evening, depending on where you are. It's currently 8:05 a.m. on a lovely Thursday morning for me. As Megan mentioned, I'm Chinmayi. You've probably seen my face a lot this past few days with NeuroCon and the workshops and whatnot. So it's good to have you all back. And let's get started. Let's chat a little bit more about leadership, how you can be a neuro leader, and kind of next directions for us as early career folks. So just a few disclaimers right off the bat. Views expressed in this session are my own. They do not represent those of my institution. And also want to acknowledge that I am not an expert leader by any means. This is a learning process, and I hope that we can all walk away at the end of the day with just some directions and kind of a little bit more insight on what leadership means, especially in like a niche community such as the sciences or the humanities, if that's what you're interested in. So Megan had a lovely little intro, but just to reiterate, I'm currently in my final year at Columbia, New York City. I'm originally from Northern California, which is where I currently am at home right now. So shout out to the West Coast folks. And outside of my work with Simply Neuroscience, something that I'm really passionate about is youth science communication and promoting youth and early career voices who are working to bridge the gap between what is behind the doors of the science labs and the general public. So really ensuring that lay people are empowered to learn more about the sciences and making science seem really exciting, because it is exciting at the end of the day. So I want to start off with a little free association, right? What comes to mind when you are thinking about leadership? Some people, you think of leader, they think of President of the United States, think of the Prime Minister of the UK, right? You think of really senior positions, or you might think of something that is close to home. So I would love to hear from you. What are some words that come to mind? One word, two word phrases when you think about leaders, when you think about leadership. Yes, Megan. Oh, you're on mute.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I feel like leadership is definitely more close to home for me. So I would say a communicator. That's my word. Yeah.
Wonderful. Yes. It's a great one. Oh, we have a lot coming in the chat. Okay. We have adaptive, inspiring, change maker, charismatic, man. That's a very interesting association. Responsibility, passionate. Communicator comes up again. Good listener, confident, role model. All right. All right. So mostly some positive connotations there, some a little bit more negative, perhaps, but all equally valid. It's kind of it's a convoluted web when you think about leadership, right? So let's also chat a little bit about some leadership myths. I think that many of us are on the right track of kind of like our ideals for leaders, but let's also review some myths, because we internalize a lot of these things. We don't necessarily recognize them as much. When I was growing up, I thought that all leaders were extroverts who were always really ready to speak with people, be super expressive, be charismatic, lead the room whenever they were in there, kind of all eyes turned to them, right? But that's not necessarily the case. Some leaders are extroverts. That's absolutely true. They are the social butterfly. They're very great about talking to people. It comes very naturally to them. But many others are also introverts. And there's pros and cons to all aspects, right? You might find that introverts are a little bit more reflective and they take a lot more time to to think about things on their own. And then when they are ready, share them with the rest of their team. While extroverts perhaps sometimes may be more willing to kind of ideate together live with other people. Neither is a bad thing. They're kind of two different ways of approaching the situation, right? So myth number 2, leaders need to know everything. Not necessarily true at all, right? You are not the expert on everything at the end of the day. If you are the senior most person in the room, that does not mean that you know literally every single person's area of expertise. What is a good example we can think of? Let's say that you are the leader of like a global health nonprofit organization. You are working on philanthropy efforts, right, to different countries and supporting under-resourced communities, bridging the gap in health needs for local systems. So there are probably individuals on your team who are very, very experienced in certain areas. Like perhaps one person is really experienced in water resource management. How can you really improve the quality of water, making sure that water is safe to drink? So they may be a scientist by training, right? Another person might be an economist, really helping you assess the financial scale of your global health efforts and making sure that you have the adequate bandwidth to support different outreach initiatives. And perhaps another person is like your social media content marketing strategist, someone who's in the communications sector, who really wants to ensure that everything that happens behind the table, behind the closed doors, gets translated to your clients, your stakeholders, the general public, your community members in an engaging and easily connectable format to them, something that is close to home. So as the leader of this organization, you may have some experience with all aspects, right? At the end of the day, you're probably familiar with how to, make some strategic decisions when it comes to the money and finances. You've probably written grants at some point, perhaps. And maybe you were even a scientist by training in your early years. I mean, leaders shift in their career trajectories. They may have training in one area and then shift to another area as they grow into their senior positions. But at the end of the day, you probably don't have a PhD in economics. You probably don't have a master's in communication and a PhD in water resource management or something like that. You don't have 10 PhDs, right? So leaders also know how to acknowledge when they don't know something. Admitting that you don't know something is not a weakness, right? You rely on team members together, and that's a part of team leadership, actually, which we will speak a little bit about later on. And also number 3, only the most senior person in the room is the leader, whether that's the oldest person, the most experienced person, or the person who literally has the title of like director of this nonprofit, CEO of Google, Microsoft, Apple, whatever it is. There are leaders in that room who are present, and it's not just that one person in the titled role. So that's important to acknowledge as well, that we all tend to perhaps gravitate towards like referring to one person as our leader. If you work in a research lab, let's say in a research group, your principal investigator, the professor, you might turn to as the leader of your lab, of course, but that does not mean that it reduces the value of the leadership of postdoctoral researchers in the lab, or your mentors who may be graduate students, PhD students. We have tiers of leadership. Hierarchies are an interesting thing to navigate, of course, when it comes to more business and industry. But I just really want to highlight the fact that like there is no one default you go to. There are definitely multiple leaders that are possible at the end of the day. Number 4, great leaders are born, not made. You probably have heard this a lot of times. Some people say, oh my God, that person has a natural tendency for leadership. They were just a born leader. Maybe in the context of the old days when a lot of the world wars were still happening. Well, I guess there are wars happening still, but in times of like Napoleon, right? You say, oh my gosh, that man is a born leader. That person is a born leader. Nowadays, we don't necessarily conform with that kind of a norm still. We understand and recognize that you can learn to become a better leader. Even folks who have that passion for leadership and that spark, you could say Napoleon is one, where you don't have people in large government positions. Everyone still has quite a ways to go to become the best version of themselves. So it is difficult to, of course, standardize between saying like, oh, on the scale of leadership ratings, I say that this person is equal to that person on that level. It's kind of a more flexible, I like to think of it as almost like different bars on like a bar chart, if everyone has their own bar peak to rise to. So at the end of the day, even if you don't consider yourself a leader right now, that doesn't mean that you can never become a leader in your life. There's always room to grow into that role. No matter how shy you consider yourself, how inexperienced you might think of yourself right now, does not mean that you will never be a leader, okay? Well, self-confidence boost there. You can be a leader. Number 5, leaders work smarter, not harder. Have you guys heard this before? Like leaders are always very strategic. It makes them sound like foxes sometimes, very like cunning, strategic. They're looking for the best scenario, really strategizing. So that's kind of a perception that's always associated. Like they don't do the grunt work. They don't do the very heavy lifting, sending 1,000 emails a day, one by one, or making a bunch of spreadsheets. And that is wrong. Leaders know that balance between the hard work that it takes to make things happen at the end of the day. And they also know how to streamline for working smarter, right? Not every single day has to be, doing the same quote unquote dirty work. If you can manage your team in a way and work with one another in a way to strategize. It could be using kind of like, that you are spending a lot of time on something that could be automated. It's about recognizing that opportunity and saying, hey, I think we can actually like adopt this new technology or this new app, this new platform, and it can help take some of the burden off our shoulders. But leaders are definitely those who know the pain of the work and the hard work and the dirty work as well. So I really push back against that one a lot, which is why it's a good myth to kind of recognize and tackle. And number 6, leaders can't show vulnerability. This is absolutely not the case as well. You will see leaders, and vulnerability means a lot of different things, right? For some folks, they think of it as like, you can almost show your emotions freely without worrying about what people judge you as. For some folks, it's like when tough times happen, people might, cry and have an emotional kind of an outburst. And that's okay. I mean, if you are in a very difficult time, let's say your startup just lost a bunch of its valuation or something like that, it's a very hard time. It's okay to kind of like recognize that and share that with team members. Many of us turn to leaders as like this very strong rock in times of crisis, which is absolutely an ideal value to have. But at the end of the day, leaders are humans too, right? There are times where they experience a lot of emotions as well, and they are carrying through a tough time as well. And of course, trying to be kind of a shoulder to lean on for their teammates. So kind of that aspect of empathy there, of leaders being able to care for their team members in times of crisis, and also for team members to be able to care for their leaders as well. It's a very reciprocal relationship. So vulnerability, it's a yay. Having empathy is a yay. It's a great point. All right. Any thoughts so far that, by the way, any thoughts that come up throughout, feel free to add them into the chat. I'm actually going to pop my chat box up on the side here so I can make sure to see all your thoughts. Anything comes up, feel free to drop that in there. All right. So you probably noticed that a lot of these things that I'm talking about, kind of assertiveness, vulnerability, empathy, all these traits are something that sounds like results from one of those personality tests. So I'm curious if anyone has taken personality tests before. Some people are super familiar with like 16 personalities. Maybe you've taken the Enneagram before. Okay, see Megan's nodding. Camille threw up a heart. So some familiarity. Some people think of this, yes, MBTI. Some people think it's a little bogus. Some people really do stand by the kind of MBTI framework. It definitely varies. But here are 2 examples. The right side, probably everyone has seen. This is one of my favorite MBTI ones with the 16 personalities and all visualized by color and everything. It's a beautiful graphic design. And the left is results from the Enneagram, where we see you have these sort of 9 points, and each of those points has different traits accordingly. So I definitely see some great responses here. People have taken the test. If you have not, I would recommend doing it. It is not going to define your life. Let me preface that. It is not going to define your life if you identify as a virtuoso versus a debater versus a logistician, right? At the end of the day, it's sort of trying to gauge what your personality fits into with these boxes, but it's just a test at the end of the day, right? It's like one of those BuzzFeed quiz results where you're like, okay, I have this result. It's fun to take. It's not going to change the rest of my life. That being said, Some align quite well. For some people, they really feel that it speaks to them. And regardless of how close or far away it might be, what I would recommend is reading through different analyses of strengths and weaknesses, right? So for some individuals, the purples usually I find can be a little bit more introverted. The architect is meant to be very like self-reflective and kind of working independently, for instance. Those individuals may find some helpful tips and guidance in the sort of analyses of how can you kind of make sure that you aren't taking the whole burden of leadership or a team's duties on yourself, but communicating with one another. It's easy to kind of say, okay, I have 20 different things. I'm going to do all of these. I mean, I'm a fall for doing that too. I definitely sign up for way too much than I should at times. So like acknowledging like, I really need to rethink what I'm signing up for. Maybe I can ask my team members what their availabilities are like, delegate accordingly, and so on and so forth. I've kind of fallen into a little bit of the purple and the green personally, so I'm not too familiar with the yellow and the blue, the explorers and sentinels here. But regardless, it's a really interesting reflection, like I've been saying, and I would recommend spending some time with it. It's also really fun to share with friends and take together and kind of see how different members in your circle, even at work perhaps, fit together. And you can even see like ways you can support one another. Some personalities work very well as coworkers. They just naturally blend together. For someone who you may have a little bit more tension with, it might be helpful to understand like where they're coming from and where you're coming from as well. Oh, yes, great question. What's my MBTI Enneagram? Also an interesting trend. I'm not sure if everyone here has seen it, but you tend to also shift over the years. For some people, it's very drastic, and some people it's like pretty close. You might shift within the same category. So I remember taking the test when I was in early high school. I was in like a homeroom class, and I got protagonist once. So that's the green guy over there. And then I've also varied between architect and commander on different occasions. So I'm like circling through. It's interesting. Yes, Derek, absolutely. It does change. It does change. Sometimes it depends on your mood when you're taking it. Sometimes it just depends on where you are in life. If you're going through a big transition period, you may have sort of a change in perspective. The Enneagram, I think I took one of those tests where it had percentages come up accordingly as in like your most top 3. And I think, I don't remember the exact order, but it was between 1, 2, and 3. So something along those lines. It's also some very interesting reads. Sometimes people judge them a little bit because they are contradictory at times. It's kind of like, I think of them, all the zodiac sign jokes sometimes, where it's like some of these fit, but some of these don't. These are not me. So that's kind of the same case with a lot of these test results as well. I was like, some of these, yeah, some of these not so much. So take what is helpful from them, leave the rest behind, right? Okay. So where are we at? 8.2. Okay. So general guiding principles. This is kind of a lot of different points here, but let's try to tie them all together. Why are we talking about leadership today in the context of neuroscience? One, we know that the field is changing, right? The boundaries and disciplines and what we think are traditionally like this field and that XYZ are shifting. So the culture is changing, and accordingly, it's a great time to tackle a lot of these hierarchies that are especially in academia is really prevalent that you might see, but also as kind of newer spaces open up, like the neuro-entrepreneurship scene with a lot more folks becoming entrepreneurs, startup founders, working on new technologies independently outside of the scope of universities or academic institutions. It also introduces a whole new landscape for leadership. And what is also cool is that there's a lot more collaboration across disciplines. Remember when we were talking about our Global Health Foundation leadership example? Those individuals came from 3 different sectors: business, communications, and kind of the sciences, environmental sciences, right? And that's collaborating across disciplines. Oftentimes within academia, there's kind of 2 ways that I've seen it tends to go. If you are within a research group, let's say, you might be surrounded by people within your one field and who are sharing a pretty similar spectrum of interests, right? That's why you're all in the same lab together. You may be working on something like the intersection of like Alzheimer's and traumatic brain injury and looking at comorbidities there. So many of y'all have a similar interest there. You might have some people who come in with like a computer science background, others with maybe a more neuroimaging background, others in a little bit more theoretical, clinical, so on and so forth. That's kind of one of the things with academia is you can get in this little bubble and stay there. It's a little bit difficult to get outside that sometimes. With industry, it can also be the same thing sometimes. You have a manager, and then you have your team. You're probably all working on a similar project. Perhaps your roles do align in that way of like one person fits the business side of the jigsaw puzzle, one person brings in the marketing communication strategies. So it really depends. Some teams are really homogenous, some are very heterogeneous. But at the end of the day, why does all this like collaborating across disciplines matter? Is because it's about approaching real world problems that need critical approaches that don't just come from one perspective. If you have a lab of 10 people who all earned their MD in neurology, and they're all working in, let's say, like one really specific niche, traumatic brain injury. I keep using that as an example, I'm a little bit biased, but you may not have the same discussions and the same perspectives come out of those conversations for that specific research group compared to another group, let's call it Lab B, who has maybe some neurologists with that MD training and TBI, but maybe they also have physical therapists come in. Maybe they have folks who worked with advocacy for brain injury individuals at the policy level. Maybe you have nurses, maybe you have students. There's a more heterogeneous, it's a more diverse group by training itself, right? And that definitely leads for more rich discussions just by virtue of everyone coming from different training paths. So we know that science at the end of the day, when it comes to the real world, is not a one-size-fits-all approach. And that's an important part of team structures as well. We can't just have a one-size-fits-all, very homogenous approach to our teams, because what does that do? It's not really reflective of the real world science. So that's kind of a little bit about like team structures, team formats, team bonds, right? And in terms of the leadership of that, when you are leading a homogenous group, everyone is kind of the same path, right? You still kind of fit into that one size fits all mold, perhaps, of like, okay, well, how do I really determine like the best ability, the best way to support everyone in their own individual career? It's a little bit tough. That's why you don't have research groups with 10 PIs at the exact same career level. You have research groups with a principal investigator who maybe, you know, like they've done their PhD, they did a postdoc, now they're a professor. And then you also have postdoctoral researchers who are maybe coming out straight of their MD or their PhD. And you have graduate students, the PhD master's candidates. You have research assistants who may be right after their baccalaureate, their undergrad degree. And you oftentimes have undergraduate and high school research interns and research assistants also. That's a lot of different levels. And there's this peer mentorship model as well. If everyone's at the same career level, that's cool. You have like peer mentorship going on. But in this more diverse structure across ages, level of experiences and expertise, you kind of have this top-down and also side-to-side approach, which is really, really important for sort of learning from those who have come before us and also supporting those who are together in the same cohort with us. That's two different models, right? Two different models of transmission. Remember a little bit earlier, I very briefly touched on the whole idea of like individual and team leadership. These kinds of more diverse structural models where it's sort of, you have this hierarchy by some way, but it also is a horizontal hierarchy. That allows for individuals to not just report to like the one person up above that I was talking about, but allows for individual leadership as well. For instance, the principal investigator, many of us are involved in research or familiar with research, I'm sure. Maybe they were working on a particular big study that just got funded by like a national organization, right? The government. That's cool. And a lot of the different individuals in the lab will probably collaborate with the PI, the principal investigator, on that study. But there's also a lot of studies happening just outside of that one grant as well, right? Otherwise, we would just have labs publishing like one paper every 4 years. That's not really great. So you may have a PhD student working on their thesis, their dissertation, their proposals and whatnot. You may have an undergraduate student who's working on a project for their bachelor's thesis, maybe in their junior or their senior year of school, the 3rd or 4th year. So everyone has different projects going on. For the undergraduate student's perspective, who might they be working with? Maybe they don't have as much of an interaction with the principal investigator, but they still get to connect with them at weekly lab meetings, let's say, or monthly meetings. Some labs have a really great atmosphere where students get to meet monthly for more career development with the PI. Depends, of course, on how large or small the lab is. But the undergraduate student may be working more closely under the supervision of a PhD student or a postdoctoral researcher, right? So there's a little leadership bubble right there as well. The graduate student may be reporting to a postdoc researcher, or they may be reporting to the PI directly, depending on what the study is, once again, that they're working, the scope of that study. So there's another leadership bubble there. So there's all these little leadership pods or leadership bubbles that are happening within the hierarchy of the lab as well. So it makes space for mentorship. And it also, this idea of this healthy environment, it allows for more non-intimidating approaches to learning from one another. I think if you are a fresh coming into college as a freshman of the first year, and if you're 17, 18, 19 years old, it may be pretty intimidating to talk to someone who's the PI of your lab, if they're in your like 60s or 50s, though many PIs are younger as well, because they have decades of experience compared to you, right? They've been doing this science for much, much longer than before you were even born. So it's like, oh my gosh, what am I going to talk about to this really accomplished person? But because of these more smaller leadership pods, you also have your graduate student mentor to talk to, your postdoctoral researcher to talk to, and you also have fellow undergrad interns to talk with, kind of to say, hey, I have literally no clue what is going on with MATLAB on this computer. Can you show me what to do? So there's that kind of a dynamic of, yes, your PI is the leader, right? But the graduate student who you talk to in that moment, who is leading you, is mentoring you, is also a leader in their own right. So is there sort of, are there like, is the senior PI sort of a better leader, or like the most important leader, perhaps because of that academic hierarchy of actually leading the formal research group on paper? Sure, but that does not undervalue any of the leadership that is happening in a more peer-to-peer mentorship level. Okay, so a lot of like mixed in thoughts here. You'll probably notice I'm like a slides minimalist. I just love free associating, but hopefully that all makes sense. And I'm more than happy to elaborate and chat on any of these principles. Yeah, 8:30, okay. So I do want to dive a little bit more into those formal neuro leadership roles. I've been using the model of this research group, this PI, as the first example that comes to mind. But I do definitely want to also share a little bit more about other career paths that can demonstrate leadership in their own right. So I'm actually, for this, referencing a guide by Princeton's advising team. It's I have the link in the references page later on, so I can also pull it up. But it's a very useful guide for just even basically looking at like what are different careers in neuroscience. So I highly recommend that. I think Boston College might also have a list. Don't quote me on that. I will find the link for that later as well. But let's start off with the research education space, since we are already here. So we've considered the whole academic, maybe the PhD route of research labs associated with different universities. And so professors, research lab heads, that's one route to go. You might also have deans, of course, or department heads. So for instance, there's a gentleman named Kevin Oxner at Columbia who leads our psychology department. So in addition to his roles as a researcher, a professor, he's also sort of the supervisor and the overseer of all the PIs in the psychology department. So that is one role. You might also have, in the case of different graduate schools or medical schools, you may have a dean of education, in which case they are leading all of the faculty lecturers, they are ensuring student wellness, right? And they're connecting with students to see how they can support them over the course of their degree. So it's a little bit more on like the less research side and more the education side, but still within this sphere for sure. You may also have in the education space, teachers and principals and people who fit into the traditional K-12 education system. You may have people who teach at the undergraduate level as a lecturer. Some people come straight out of their master's or their PhDs and want to go into working with students. That is also leadership in its own right. It's kind of odd to think about the teacher as a leader, but you're leading their education, right? You're mentoring these students and you're leading them in their career paths. So that's definitely one route. Perhaps some of us went to high schools that had connections with public engagement initiatives or science initiatives. I know in New York, a lot of the public high schools have connections with BioBus, which is this really neat like mobile neuroscience clinic, mobile science clinic, where students get to connect with science on wheels, basically. So in those cases, people who lead those initiatives like BioBus are also leaders in their own right. They're leaders in the outreach and the education space outside of a formal school framework. So that's a wonderful career path as well. And it's often much more flexible in scope compared to academia even, right? Because outreach programs are often kind of the extracurricular aspect of institutions. So it's kind of a whole different space of its own, right? So that's a lot of different things about education. Maybe I'll mention the dean of education on the medical school side. Of course, there are teams of doctors who you might see in like the movies, right? Like Grey's Anatomy, you have this whole team of doctors, you have medical students, residents, you have fellows, then you have the doctor, you have the senior attending, right? So the senior attending is also leading a team of doctors. That comes with, of course, experience and practice over the years, but you also have, even at the residency level, and I understand that this probably translates in very different ways outside of the United States, but if you think of doctors who are just, they've received their degree and are starting to practice under the supervision of a doctor, I'm referring to that as residency. There is also chief residents. Remember that peer-to-peer mentorship we talked about with like students who are close by one another in expertise level? That's a perfect example of near-peer experience. Someone who's probably a year or 2 years above where you are currently, who can reflect on their experiences, since that is much more closer in time to you compared to someone who perhaps was a resident 20 years ago. Does not mean that their advice is in any way not as equally important. It just may mean that since times change in academia, the whole career paths change, everything, the availability, flexibility changes, near-peer mentorship is often very timely relative to the current context. So that's a little bit about the medical team. If you are consulting with a very ill patient, let's say, you may have individuals on that team that consist of interprofessional relationships. You might have a physician, you may have a nurse, you may have a physical therapist, you may have a respiratory therapist, you may have like a dietitian who's working on the patient's nutritional needs. So a lot of different roles there, a lot of different roles. And you often have one point of contact for that team. It's just another example of leadership that comes to mind. Okay. Does anyone have any other examples that come to mind? When you think of roles in leader research, education, we've kind of veered into a little bit of healthcare as well. Feel free to drop them in the chat. This is not an exhaustive list by any means. There's so many wonderful opportunities. Oh, the global health example we mentioned before, I should probably reference that here. It ties into healthcare as well. Nonprofits, and we'll also tie this into the entrepreneurship space. Nonprofit leadership is a wonderful, wonderful way to get involved in leadership in the neuro community. And once again, in a very flexible manner. So if any of y'all were at NeuroCon on Sunday, or perhaps it was Monday your time, you remember Ishan Dasgupta, who came from the Dana Foundation. So he leads a lot of the Dana Foundation's efforts on next generational outreach efforts and connectivity efforts. But the Dana Foundation itself is a really solid example of kind of science philanthropy in action and supporting science outside of like an academic or university institution. So they are a small team. And Mr. Dasgupta mentioned something that was very key. At times, everyone has all hands on deck, right? So perhaps in a normal time, Mr. Dasgupta leads like XYZ activities, but when there is something really busy happening, when all of the other different team initiatives need help, that does not mean that he's not going to also help out with anything A to Z where his expertise can be relevant, right? So an example that, yes, he leads XYZ initiative, but in time of crisis, leader, you also want to support your team members however you can. So I thought that was a really poignant point that he had brought up on Sunday. So I just want to mention that as well with nonprofits. There is kind of an interesting relationship, the transition between nonprofit organizations to the entrepreneurship side. When you go into neurotechnology, there's a lot of medical technology, a lot of technology centers in the entrepreneurship space. But also if you are working with like neuroeconomists, or you are consulting for an organization. You could even be serving as like a chief scientific officer for a certain a pharmaceutical company, for a certain tech company. All of those avenues are also leadership within the business and entrepreneurship space. I think sort of a lot of the common, sorry, feeling a sneeze coming up. Promise I don't have COVID. A lot of the discussion and the ambiance that you might see in the entrepreneurship space with startups is that people are like solo founders or co-founders, or just a team of 1 or 2 people who are ready to go make a difference in the world. So a lot of the starting off part is definitely, it's a lot of just individual leadership. Yeah, thank you, Megan. It's definitely a lot of just solo leadership at the start. You are playing the role of like 10 different things at once, right? You may be doing marketing, website design, You are all over the place at times. So in that case, leadership is not so much of like leading a team of 20 people, but leading yourself and leading this initiative solo, right? So making a difference as a solopreneur. I actually don't know if that's a word. Maybe it is. Who knows? Solopreneur. Wonderful. So business and entrepreneurship. Kind of covered that a little bit. Looping around to publishing and writing. We actually don't have a link for this, so Megan, don't worry about searching for this one. Dr. Floridia, who spoke at the very start of Simply NeuroCon on Sunday, her talk was not recorded, but she is part of the editing and the publishing team at Nature Neuroscience, which is one of the very cool journals in the neuroscience field. It's one of the top high impact journals. So writing and publishing, why do I say this is leadership? Even if you're a part of the editing team, you have this sort of curatorship role where you define what research gets shared and amplified as part of the Nature Neuroscience Journal. And I think that's leadership too, at its own equal right. That was a great talk. Because you have this sort of, you are setting the tone for what is shared and disseminated through this really, really large established journal. And so it takes a lot of review and a lot of reflection, of course, and making sure that pieces are selected in a relevant manner to the contemporary context. You're kind of doing a lot of different checks at the same time. You're reviewing for like value, merit, contributions, ethical perspectives, and so on and so forth. But also that's sort of the publishing process, right? You also have science journalists who are leading discourse, setting the tone for what a lot of the general public talks about. It's a form of communication in its own. Ed Young is a really, really prominent journalist, a science journalist who you should definitely check out. I don't believe his expertise is in the neuroscience field specifically, but he's a very, very poignant science journalist and definitely has shaped conversations and highlighted important issues that the public needs to consider. So you're shaping a lot of discourse there. And of course, you also have folks who are working for maybe larger agencies like the NIH and CDC and whatnot, who are ensuring, a perfect example would be like the press secretary for the US government. It's one example. Someone who's like a spokesperson, right? Spokesperson who kind of steps forward and says, okay, this is what all 100 people of my team are kind of working on right now. And here's what's important for you to learn. So kind of translating everything that your team is doing into an easily understandable format. That's also leadership in its own way. You're kind of acting as a spokesperson, as a representative, as a point of contact. All right. So that's a little bit about publishing, a little bit on the creative sector. Let's see. And then last one's government policy. Cool. I have y'all's videos on one side of my screen, so I can't see a half of there. So I'm moving you guys around. The creative sector. This one is probably the most flexible out of anything that we've spoken about so far. What are some examples? You have folks who are working on TV shows, let's say, who are producing documentaries and who are leading teams that come from very different industries, right? You might be working with science consultants. You might be working with like multimedia producers. You might be working with people who do the actual video editing, design, graphics, and everything. So those teams are often like a lot of different folks from a lot of different career paths and walks of life coming in, which makes for very merry creative ideas coming out and being produced and shared. You might also have, here's an interesting one. There's a lot of folks working in like the music area, let's say, right? And trying to look at music therapies. And so there's pioneers in the field who, because it isn't necessarily like, we all understand and acknowledge that for folks like for individuals who have dementia, let's say for senior citizens, music is a great connectivity tool, right? The implementation of music therapies into hospitals and clinics is still on its way. Not everywhere has the resource or bandwidth to make it happen, but there are definitely pioneers in that avenue who are perhaps working on building these networks of musicians and performers who are willing to go into hospitals and actually perform live for the patients there. So that's a form of leadership that falls outside of the other traditional realms that we have spoken about. You might also have these individuals who are kind of the start of their, Megan, do you see it be recording? I thought I hit record. Yeah, so this is recording. So all the slides are in the recording as well. Whew, just panicked a second. You might have pioneers, right? This music aspect is definitely one that's gained some traction in the past few years. It's on its way, which is amazing. And then you also have folks who are like, literally, you think of them as the mother or the father or the parent of a certain field in neuroscience, right? So what is one good example? Well, I think of these two individuals are not the only people in this field. I want to preface that. But I think of two pioneers in like the intersection of neuroscience, nutrition and diet, nutritional neuroscience, as Dr. Lisa Mosconi and Dr. Uma Naidu. Uma Naidu actually came in as one of our NeuroCon speakers a few years ago. So her recording is somewhere on the YouTube. It'll probably take some digging to find. But these two wonderful humans are trying to help raise awareness about the gut and the brain and their connectivity, and how what we eat truly influences our mood, and our diet can affect perhaps our recovery and outcomes for different health conditions that we're dealing with. So if you are sort of making these groundbreaking movements in the neuroscience field without a lot of necessarily research happening right now, that's a leadership in itself in terms of pioneering a new avenue of study or a new approach. Perhaps one of y'all might invent a new neuroimaging technique or a technology in the future. That can also be leadership in its own right, perhaps a little veering into entrepreneurship there. Government and policy, I'm not going to cover in depth because we had two amazing presentations this week about those from Ms. Schmel and Dr. Adriana Bankston. But of course, you can imagine science policy fellows who are working in the offices of different federal and state level and even city level offices, and working to shape discourse on the government level about what policies are important. Public health, especially, a lot of public health leaders work in the government and policy realm. You may also see scientists themselves who run for elected office, which is always really cool to see. So that's a means of kind of your training, being put into public service, and having a really great impact there. So definitely the roles in this area, I think, would vary a lot from country to country. I know a lot of us come from outside of the US as well, so I don't really want to dive too deep into that as well. But it's a great area to explore. Certainly very needed and important. We need to get science to have more of an impact and a voice at the government level as well. So I just wanted to give a shout out before we kind of wrap up with, what comes next? We've talked about all this. Okay, what are you going to do after this call? Some leaders I'm inspired by. Dr. Lucina Udin, I would really recommend checking out her work. She's based out of the University of California, Los Angeles. So shout out to California folks. She's also the founder of this really cool community that is building up off the ground right now called SAPNA, the South Asian Psychology and Neuroscience Association. So SAPNA meaning dream as well is a really fitting title. And key that I really love about her leadership is she's very approachable and accessible. She's always keen to mentoring. I think one thing that stands out to me with leaders is that they're really open to mentorship and sharing their insight. And so that's kind of one value of leadership that I truly look for in mentors. Another individual, Dr. Mariam Ali, is actually was my PI for a few years. She's based out of Columbia Psychology, also works with the Zuckerman Institute. It's one of the premier neuroscience institutes. What I really appreciate about her leadership is she works to destigmatize mental illness that a lot of trainees might be suffering from as well. And sort of making space for those conversations is something that she's really awesome about. And she's also part of this initiative called Reviewer Zero, where they are trying to reimagine the peer review process with publication, especially for the early career scholars that are coming up and about. Because publication is kind of a convoluted process sometimes when you're starting out. Shout out to Dr. Ellie. Diana Seville is one of my mentors, who I'm really thankful to say is super awesome and involved in the social entrepreneurship space. She leads a community known as Brain Mind. That is kind of an ecosystem connecting predominant members of the neuro and psychology community together, advancing innovation, a lot of connections. And she also founded this initiative called EO, Entrepreneur of Your Own Life, I believe is what it stands for fully, supporting low-income college students and young students pursuing their education. So she's also a scientific animator, illustrator. Her work is really cool. So if anyone is interested in more of that creative side of neuroscience, would recommend checking her website out. And last but not least, I would really just love to highlight Dr. Nadia Chowdhury. I'm not sure if anyone here is familiar with her, but she unfortunately passed away last year due to ovarian cancer. She was based in Canada at Concordia University in Montreal. And in her kind of, after her illness diagnosis, she was just really, really amazing and heartwarming in terms of her fundraising efforts for underrepresented scholars to pursue their, education and training. So would also recommend reading about her and her legacy. Is a really inspiring human as well. So sad that she's not on the earth anymore, but really amazing female leaders that I just wanted to share with y'all. I think they really set an amazing precedent for many folks to come, and they're awesome role models. And I think we can learn a lot from them. So what's next? Many of us are early career folks. We're not professors yet. What are we going to do? How are we leaders in our own right? So here's how we can get started. I'm curious, how many of us are involved with student clubs at our school, at our university, or maybe it can be something like a gardening club as well. It doesn't have to be neuroscience related, right? Probably a lot of us. I can't see everyone's faces here, but I'm sure you're nodding along like my goodness. It's a great opportunity to practice leadership skills in a nonchalant, low pressure way when you're involved with student initiatives. You can take lead on organizing an event or a book club or a gardening session. And you can work with folks in a very low pressure, low stress environment. You often have the support of a club advisor who you can refer to as well. So I would, if you're not already thinking about student clubs, it's a very usually no cost way to get involved and practice those skills early on. And connecting with mentors and networking. We're in the age where LinkedIn and Twitter and everything is super accessible, right? Elvisha Damla, who's coming in next, is going to share a little bit about the process of science communication over Twitter, but it's really much more accessible these days to reach out to someone and ask, hey, can I have a few minutes of your time? I just want to chat and learn more about your leadership role. If you are the chief scientific officer or founder of this startup, or you're a PI, I would really want to get to that place one day. I'm exploring that career path. Can I have a few minutes of your time? I believe Spatika might have had some email. I'm forgetting who had email drafts. I think Meredith. Meredith had an informational interview email draft. So check that presentation out. Nikita, tomorrow is Friday. Nikita's presentation tomorrow might also have some tips on that as well. So if you are interested in roles, of course, in leadership, you're not really sure what might be involved in preparation from them. Do you need to get a certain degree? Need to get certain training fellowships in the science policy realm? There's a lot of internships and fellowships. It's always really great to connect with folks who have come before us and learn more about what they've done. So ties into also building concrete skills early on. We've talked about how leadership can come through training. Not all of us are natural born leaders. It's hard to identify them, but that doesn't mean that we can start practicing these early on. These kind of skills are ones that are soft skills, right? They're not necessarily ones that you can list on your CV as bullet point leadership. you show them through their actions, right? You show them through, I led this initiative, I organized this event. I even led a small group of tutors at my college. It was really small scale, but it was still leadership. So those kinds of things you can start to build early on, regardless of where you are in your career. There's a way to have that leadership involvement in some way, shape, or form, no matter how big, no matter how small. And what I want to conclude on is that you should always be your best cheerleader. I think it was Rosalind mentioned earlier, the association that came to mind when thinking of a leader was man. Because a lot of men are in very senior positions in academia, healthcare, and leadership and whatnot in government. So there's a lot of statistics. I unfortunately don't have one off the top of my head where women often wait longer until they meet these certain expectations for a job position that they're applying to compared to men, let's say. So women may oftentimes even be overqualified for a position that they're applying to because they may feel not so sure about if they're going to get the position or not. But be your best cheerleader, put yourself forward, self-nominate for different awards and opportunities and whatnot, right? And you can always also maybe reach out to mentors early on and say, hey, I'm really interested in this program, but I need a letter of nomination. Would you be interested in nominating me for this award? It could be for like a conference travel award. There's a lot of conferences happening this year, right? That are coming back in person or hybrid. So you can always ask for those letters of support in putting yourself forward and saying, I think I fit this role well. I think I have demonstrated leadership and I'd like to be considered, right? So I do want to say that a lot of women, a lot of folks who are minorities, who belong to the LGBT community, who identify as disabled, maybe those who, for those who English is not their first language, there's a lot of intimidating factors that come into like presenting themselves as the kind of leader, right? The big person. But I do want to encourage you, it's just something that we build over time in terms of self-confidence, and that could be a whole different workshop, but it is definitely something that I want you guys to think about, keep in mind. All right, so just looking to the future, a little inspirational quote here. As we look ahead into the next century, leaders will be those who empower others. So I do want to encourage you to think about how as a leader, you can also be a mentor and give back at the end of the day. I mentioned that that's one of my core values, and I really hope that that aspect of mentorship and next generation support becomes a core value for you as well in leadership. So these are some references. URLs, oh, I realized they might not show up in the recording, but what I would recommend looking up from here is the 16 personalities, the Enneagram test. Look up Princeton Neuroscience Careers Advising page, and you'll find this awesome page that I was drawing references from. So those are references. And if you ever want to be in touch, you can find me on IG, Twitter, LinkedIn. I'll be at these Simply Neuroscience events, tagging along. So I'll be sure to, we'll be sure to run into one another at some point. Thanks for joining. I'm going to stop screen sharing so I can see you all.
Thank you, Chinmayi. Does anyone have any questions for her? I actually do have one really quickly. So,
yeah.
So just now, all of the like skills and attributes for leadership that you mentioned, as well as just neuroscience as a field as a whole, were like really male focused and male dominated. So how do you suggest female or people of gender minorities to be able to break through these stereotypes and become good leaders?
Absolutely. Yeah, a lot of the resources and things you will see are definitely like, they have to be adapted for non-males as well. I would say that a lot of it is small actions that can add up to something big, right? Not all advocacy is big. For it, as an example, I'm involved with this group that works on a repository database for women who are interviewed by journalists, let's say, or you know how a lot of people show up in news media sources as science experts. So they're putting a repository together of women scientists who you can reach out to easily in that case. So it's a matter of, people can't use the excuse anymore of, oh, I can't find a women scientist to interview in this XYZ area, because now you have a spot to go. So a lot of the times it's like you see a gap and you say like, how can we start inching towards this of like, what is the most common excuse that comes up? let's target that. We see a lot of women aren't funded, for example. This could be a whole nother workshop too, funded for their time as speakers and big conferences, especially if they're like big, really notable professors, but they aren't given honoraria or support and recognition for their time. It's kind of the concept of free labor. So in those cases, there's also like databases where women can see examples from previous women who were advocating to receive these honoraria and recognition for their time and use those as examples. So a lot of it kind of notice that trend of like passing resources along and not kind of lifting up the ladder once you're through. That's super important. A lot of folks share their email drafts for how they receive these amazing internship positions and whatnot. A lot of people share tips for like, guest speaker tips. If you're starting out as a professor, for instance, where do you kind of start with developing a lab handbook where you've been invited to this really big conference as a speaker? Here are some tips from the previous year's lineup. So it's a lot of like actually carrying along that knowledge and not just being like, oh, I have all this resources and I'm going to keep it to myself. So I think those are some things.
So thank you for that answer. I will definitely apply some of those in my real life. So there are 2 questions in chat. I know we are running out of time, but Ankit has just asked, is it necessary to showcase our leadership by starting an organization?
No, not at all.
Okay.
And
yeah.
Okay, I'll very briefly elaborate on this because I know we're at time. Oh, thanks, Elvisha. Not at all. And I do want to acknowledge that I don't mean to be a hypocrite by any means. I know that I do lead Simply Neuroscience, but I also fully acknowledge that I did not intend for this organization to be an organization. It was literally the name of my blog. And here we are. And that's because of all the people who came in along the way who are not CEO right now, but who literally said, I have an idea. I want to make a podcast. And I would love to spearhead this initiative because I think that I could gather a team of folks who are equally as passionate and make it happen, right? So that's an example of someone who did not have a titled leadership role coming in. They were just a fresh new member, was a really awesome volunteer. And he said, I see this gap. I want to do something about it. Can I? And I was like, of course. So case A. Case B, a lot of folks who are working in like community service locally, you could be organizing a bake sale fundraiser, right? And perhaps donating causes to, I saw a recent kid on TV who used his Eagle Scout project to build like a veterans memorial, right? And that's of course like the Boy Scouts program and the Eagle Scouts program, Girl Scouts program. They're all very formal examples of leadership kind of development and support. But even something as small as like, I'm organizing a bake sale because I want to donate proceeds to something. That's something that's local. And that's something that you can see its impact in front of you. And that's an example of local leadership. And that's not starting an organization. So my honest tip would be like, if you have an idea that you think would support an existing cause, reach out to an existing organization and say, I have this idea. Can I help spearhead this or join a team that's working on this and contribute my ideas? That way we're not also like worrying about resource overlaps and everything. There are so many well-established initiatives for like many things like women in STEM organizations. There's so many well-established chapter networks and everything out there. So you can take advantage of those existing platforms rather than worrying about the actual kind of learning curve of setting up something new. But, maybe if you're interested in the entrepreneurship space, we always need new innovative perspectives for startup founders. So who knows?
Okay, one last question in chat. How do you portray leadership in any other applications? And I know Ankit also asked for your contact info, so I'll just put the public contact info in.
Sure thing. Yeah, I can also drop links right now. I'm answering. So how do you portray leadership? I'm assuming this is in like the context of maybe you're applying to a leadership role and you're like want to demonstrate previous experience, or perhaps you're showcasing something on your CV. Okay. What are ways to go about doing so? Remember that example of like, I led a small group of tutors at my high school. It could have been 3 tutors. But if you kind of took on the role of, I want to coordinate all communications for us, I want to recruit mentees for us, That's leadership. And the way that you talk about it, the language is what can change everything at the end of the day. I can't think of a good example off the top of my head, but I would recommend searching into Google, like action verbs or language for resumes or CVs. And you'll see that there's a really big difference in portraying leadership from when you say, I raised $2,000. Cool. Great. That's awesome. But you can also expand on that by saying, I coordinated with XYZ community partners. I cold contacted them. I scheduled calls with them. I made flyers and shared them with local businesses and restaurants and asked them to give like 10% of proceeds to our business for charity. And if you detail that, that shows the amount of work that you put in more than just one little itty bitty bullet point. And I know resumes don't have a lot of space, which is why I'm recommending search up those like action verbs, which can convey a lot of meaning, right? It's different to say I led versus like, or I supervised versus, yeah, it's tough to think of examples around the top of your head of with these verbs of like, I initiated and I coordinated and I organized a group of 10 students in raising $2,000. Be like quantitative and also showcase like, what was the impact of what you did at the end of the day? Maybe you raised 10,000. Okay, but what did that do? Did you contribute to inaugurating this Veterans Memorial? Did you contribute to X, Y, and Z? So there's a lot of existing resources out there on the internet. Something I'm practicing too with those action variables. And okay, links. Okay, here's Twitter. And thank you for your questions, everyone. You can always feel free to reach out. And I can go ahead and pass it over to Megan, back to you. So we're a little over time.
Thank you, Chinmayi, for this amazing presentation.